Hi, we move into 2 Samuel 6 today as we continue to explore David's consolidation of the legitimacy of his royal reign in 2 Samuel 5 to 10. As you can see on the right side of the screen, and we've gone through these four in chapter 5 so far: his taking of the stronghold of Zion to give him a royal city, his developing an alliance with King Hiram of Tyre to build David's palace, who will also return and be a supporter of Solomon. The display of masculine power and fertility through taking unnamed women and having 11 more sons that are named, and the display of divine reliance for victory as he consults Yahweh and twice either defeats the Philistines or at least attacks them, depending on how you translate that. And now we're going into this section here in chapter 6, as I've titled it, a quote-unquote redemption of a past national shame. I put it in quotes because the text doesn't actually use that language, but as we'll see, that's what's going on, and it reaches right back to the very beginning of 1 Samuel when the people had to face the fact that the priest Eli, his sons were corrupt, and Samuel was still a young boy, and there was no one to lead Israel in the face of the Philistines. So we'll see how this is seeking to redeem that ugly start to the story in 1 and 2 Samuel. As we do, we're going to see deep connections between this chapter and the whole unit that we see in 1 Samuel 4 to 7. I've only shown part of it here, but we'll look more at that as we go. As we'll note here in verse 2, it describes that he went out from Baal, Judah, which may be a place name or it may be named people, as we'll see. But we knew the ark from chapter 6 and beginning of chapter 7 in 1 Samuel 1. Chapter 7 in 1 Samuel was here at Kiriath Jearim, and so most scholars assume that's where it was because it said it was there for 20 years, as we'll see. And the last scene had taken place in this valley of Rephaim here, so we're in this roughly in the same period, same place. And as we look at a new chapter, there's quite a number of important key words here. Chapter 5 didn't work on a lot of key words because it covered a number of different topics, but this whole chapter is about the ark. And so we can see the ark many, many times. As Falkman notes, the ark of God, of Elohim, is 7 times in the chapter, and the ark of Yahweh is 7 times in the chapter. That really underscores the point that trying to separate this by sources, that one uses Yahweh and one uses God, really falls apart here because they're deeply integrated, as we can see, mixed in with each other. And if you try to separate them out, it really ruins the story, which fits together nicely just as it is, as we'll see. So we're not going to worry about that. As I've noted here just briefly, we can see a number of elements in which the rough story is similar, which is to say, people cry out that the ark seems dangerous. Here it was the people of Ekron, which is to say the Philistines, following up on the previous chapter, in chapter 4, that we'll see some parallels here, where it gave them hemorrhoids or something like that, and they were in a great panic about it, trying to get rid of it. So they tried to send it away. Similarly, in our chapter, as we'll see, people are afraid of it. It bursts out, and we already saw a bursting out in the little battle against the Philistines. So more bursting out here, showing, as it showed there, Yahweh's freedom from human control. Then we also see rejoicing. We see the people of Beth Shemesh rejoiced when they saw the ark, and then we see the house of Abinadab the Gittite also involves a blessing and rejoicing, as we'll see. There was shouting, etc. And then finally, in the end of the first one, the house of Israel lamented that they lost the ark, and here they celebrate that the ark had been returned. So as we do that, let's look more closely at the passage we're going to look at today, just the first 5 verses. And we can see how in the dark blue you see our text here, and in the green we see echoes from 1 Samuel in this whole unit. So we see where 30,000 men died here. David picks a 30,000, which, as we can see, is really irrelevant for the purpose, which is just to bring the ark back. You hardly need 30,000 men to take the ark back from a friendly location. It's not like he has to fight the Philistines to take it back. So that's certainly meaning to echo this. Then we see the exact same phrase that we'll look at more closely, Yahweh of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim, and we see that exactly in both places. Putting the ark in a new cart, first in the house of Abinadab we saw there, and now leaving that here, here, this is the old one and this is the new one, to leave the house of Abinadab. We saw the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, who died, and then we'll see the 2 sons of Abinadab, and Uzzah later in our story will also die, not Ahio though. And then, as I noted, the previous story ends with the lament, after all the house of Israel lamented after Yahweh, and now we see all the house of Israel were dancing before Yahweh. So that's the redemption we see there. So let's leave this up as we begin to look more closely at our passage. So then David again gathered all the chosen men. And we noted last time when he went to strike the Philistines, when he just went up to take the stronghold of Zion, it just said he took his men. They were not the men of Israel. They're not anything like an army. They're not described as an army here either. This is not an army situation as far as we can tell. The phrase chosen men of Israel echoes what we saw in 1 Samuel 26, where it was Saul who gathered them there. And the contrast that I was noting was not his, which is say David's men, as we saw just earlier in chapter 5 in 2 Samuel. So that 30,000 is certainly symbolic of the 30,000 who were slain. So then moving on here, we hear David and all the people with him set out and went from Baal Judah. And as Falkman notes, a subtle token of David's haste, the center of attention does not rest in the starting point, but makes toward the journey's destination. And they takes that from went from. But one of the issues is Baal Judah just another name for Kiriath Jearim, which is how Seau sees it. He equates it with that, as we can see here, and follows that from Joshua 15:10, which we can see here, down the northern sort of Mount Jearim. So there's nothing there that suggests it's Baal Judah, but that's Sau's conclusion. Naaman, on the other hand, renders the Baal as citizens or lords of Judah, much like the lords of the Philistines, although we've not seen lords of Judah before, and he's exploring various spelling differences and emendations to make that fit. Whenever you start having to change spellings and change things to make it fit, you always have to be concerned, though. But he sees this verse as originally a continuation of 1 Samuel 7:1 that we see here, down at the end of here. He says, quote, the attribution of a derogatory designation to the Judahites who accompanied David on his way to bring the ark as a result of the failure of David's first attempt to bring the ark to Jerusalem. And notice how he's interpreting the reference to Baal there as a negative designation of the Judahites, whereas we saw earlier that Falkman noted that the use of Baal was an ordinary thing in early Israel, and it didn't necessarily imply a denigration of their worship of Yahweh. So two scholars reading that two different ways, and therefore deciding whether the text is saying something negative about David in failing to bring the ark to Jerusalem. Of course, in 1 Samuel, David wasn't on the scene yet, so that's referring to not to David there. So he went with them to bring up the ark, up from there, the ark of God, as again noting the repetition. As Brueggemann notes, Israel has not even thought of the ark since it was deposited in the house of Abinadab. After 20 years of dormancy, the ark is now recalled as a vehicle for royal legitimation. Of course, we don't know that Israel hasn't thought about it. It's not reported in the story. But plainly, David is thinking about it, and he recognizes that he needs that symbol as part of showing that Yahweh's on his side. But it's dangerous, as we'll see, so he better watch out. So this phrase, which is called by the name of Yahweh of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim, sets up a very interesting situation, because the phrase is similar to the essence, the sense of it being enthroned on the cherubim is both what we hear from Exodus about the Mishkan, the Hebrew word for the traveling tabernacle that they make in the wilderness and put the ark of the covenant inside the tabernacle, versus the temple. And both of them involve two cherubim. Solomon starts with olive wood, but then is covered with gold, and the Mishkan one simply has the gold. Here's James Tissot's picture of Moses and Aaron worshiping before that, and you can see on the top of it, as it's described here in the Exodus story, the cherubim shall spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat. With their wings they shall face one another and be turned toward the mercy seat. And there in the ark you shall put the covenant that I shall give you, which is to say the tablets of the Ten Commandments. In this Mishkan. And so, as I wrote in my book, Come Out My People, one of the great struggles between religion of empire and religion of creation in the Bible is this relationship between whether we experience God in the free-flowing and moving Mishkan that was made by all the people, or in the imperial product of the temple, where Yahweh will be captive, so to speak, within the royal confines there. And scholars who read it in sequence, that the Exodus leads to kings, that the Mishkan leads to the temple, suggest that the bottom line is that the religion of empire entire as what was intended. But that depends upon when you think the texts were written and the order of compilation, etc. So my argument is certainly the opposite, that the Exodus story is written as a counter story to the monarchy story, precisely to offer a different image of that. But in our immediate situation, there's no Mishkan present and there's no temple. We'll hear in chapter 7 that when Yahweh objects to David wanting to build a temple for Yahweh, Yahweh's response is, I've lived in a tent or in a Mishkan as I traveled with the Israelites from Mount Sinai. So we see a reference to it in the very next chapter, but there's no reference to it right here. So called by the name of the Lord of hosts enthroned on the cherubim, but there's no sense of where this is, where the enthronement takes place. Is that meant to be on the ark? That's not clear. So Yahweh of hosts, as we've seen, is the expression of Yahweh, the military leader, and we see that again in 6:18, and then we'll see it in chapter 7. We saw it a number of times in 1 Samuel. The word for enthroned is over-translating here. It's Yoshev, simply meaning seated or settled at, and yet, as my note from Graham Auld has below, there's no preposition in the Hebrew, so it, quote, leaves the reader to deduce the relationship between the seated one and the cherubim. Since the wings may function to conceal Yahweh, it may be preferable to understand the phrase to mean seated or enthroned between or among the cherubim. And obviously Tissot's painting doesn't have Yahweh there, but shows him on the ends of it, as it's described in the passage we see on the right side of the screen here. So having described it that way for us and linking it back to our passage here in 1 Samuel, we see this. And my note connecting that as we see on the right side. They carried the ark of God on a new cart. Is there any particular reason to have a new cart? In 1 Samuel, it was the Philistines' idea. We'll see something similar in Numbers. See how it compares the animal-drawn carts used for the procession of the divine statue of Ningirsu in Mesopotamia, and that may well be relevant. It depends upon when we think our passage is written. And I've been noting in the introductory video, this little section here where David is legitimizing his reign certainly seems to be later than the story of the succession, the story that will follow with David passing on the succession to Solomon. And as we were noting in the stories on 1 Samuel, that some of that may well be exilic, contrasting Saul's reign with David's. But here, with the echoes of Deuteronomy that we'll see and the echoes of the Exodus story, this certainly seems like it's a relatively late story. So, but we can't say that for sure. So they carried it on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which is what we saw in the end of 1 Samuel 7 here, which is on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab. Uzzah related to the Hebrew word Oz for power or might, as in Psalm 132. The sons of Abinadab were driving the new cart, a word usually used for driving people out, as we see in Deuteronomy 28:37, Nahagim here, 30 times in the Masoretic text, with the Ark of God. Notice the Ark of God here, but Yahweh here, and Yahweh again here, so all very tightly integrated. And Ahio in front of the Ark. Lifnei ha'eron, which is to say, in the face of it. The only time the ark is mentioned without God or Yahweh in the chapter. But Lifnei is 7 times in the chapter, as you can see in the key words. Wherever it's translated in front of or before, I translated literally as in the face of. So we can see the intimacy of that, in the face of the ark, but also in the face of Yahweh many times here. So now we see David and all the house of Israel, last at 112, but previously only in our parallel scene that I was just noting. So we've not seen all the house of Israel very much, just at the beginning of our 2 Samuel and then echoing that. We're dancing, or using the word meshakim from Shach, which has an interesting word because it can be used, it's the word used in Exodus 32 for what they're doing before the golden calf, with a sexual connotation. And we'll see that by the end of the chapter, it has more sexual connotation when David's wife, Michal, the daughter of Saul, spots David dancing before the servant girls in the street and decides that she will have no further relations with him after he's dancing out there, clad simply in an ephod. So he's dancing in all the house of Israel before the face of Yahweh with all their might, although the translation is very difficult here. Falkman suggests all kinds of instruments of wood. The Norasvi and altar follow First Chronicles here because they've simplified, as it often does. Sometimes they simplify to take out things they don't like, and sometimes they simplify when the text seems garbled in some way. The word for barash is cypress wood, and it's only here in Samuel, but we'll see it several times in 1 Kings for what Solomon is doing to decorate the temple. So in many ways, as we've already seen, there are hints in these opening chapters of setting up what we're seeing in chapter 7. And all the videos I've shown so far of all this show in each one there's some hint of setting that up, especially around the theme of Yahweh's freedom. So there's interestingly no word for songs in the Hebrew here, but all these different instruments bring up something we've seen before. The lyres and harps, etc., bring up the scene from 1 Samuel 10:5, when Samuel tells Saul that he will go and meet a band of prophets coming down from the shrine, that's a shrine at Ramah, with harp, tambourine, flute, and lyre playing in front of them in a prophetic frenzy. And Saul will be in that too, and people will ask, is Saul also among the prophets? Is it the instruments that generate that? Is that what we're supposed to hear here? That David is replicating the prophetic frenzy that Saul was in back in 1 Samuel 10? We don't hear that from him, but perhaps that's what's implied here. Lyres, as we saw, kinnor, is used there, and it's also what David played. So David would be very familiar with that. That's when he was soothing Saul, when Saul's mind was not focused, if we can put it that way. And harps, or nevel here, also part of that scene in 1 Samuel 10, and once in 1 Kings. The tambourines, interestingly, brings up the women singing in the Exodus story after the Egyptian chariots and charioteers are in the Reed Sea, and so they're singing with tambourines, and perhaps that's meant to be an echo of that. The word for castanets here, uvamena anamim, here is only here in the Masoretic text, and so we don't know much about that. And the cymbals are in a psalm. And so I'm going to stop there, because after this, things go bad, and we'll have to explore what it's saying about Yahweh and what David's response is when this happy scene suddenly turns very dark. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.